Well, Tim Forslund from Sitra. Tim has been looking into this issue of biodiversity also and circular economy, in fact, in Sitra for a good while. So really a leading expert on these global transitions to circular economy. So you've been, Tim, analyzing and quantifying the potential to tackle biodiversity loss and climate change in this, in particular from the viewpoint of circular bioeconomy, business model innovation, and for deforestation associated soft commodities, national resource targets, and science-based targets. So very well versed in this, and of course, Tim has been a leading author of a report which Sitra has recently drafted on biodiversity and circular economy. So we are really grateful to have you, Tim, here telling us about your report and sharing your views on that. Then we have Barbara Obert, who works for the IUCN in the European regional office here in Brussels. So Barbara's work is really about informing us about the relevant issues on the biodiversity related policies in the Brussels context. So focusing on the sustainable land use and the circular economy in particular. Previously, Barbara worked as a policy and research consultant at the ECORIS, where she was carrying out environmental research projects for the European Commission. So great to have you, Barbara, with us. And IUCN has also published a recent report on this. So we are very grateful also to get to hear those recent news. And that's not even at the end of it, because we have also Timo Lehesvaara from the Metsä Group. Metsä Group is a leading Finnish forestry company, so one of the leading companies in developing circular economy solutions in the nexus with biodiversity. And Timo, as the leading biodiversity nature expert in Metsä Group, is here to tell us about a report which is even more recent than the two previous ones, which Metsä Group has just published, showcasing their new company strategy, which is really about climate change mitigation, ecosystem services in an interesting way. So Timo, we really look forward to hearing from you as well. So three recent reports, three perspectives, and then obviously we are in Brussels and talking about EU policy. So the European Commission indispensably present. So really glad to have Anna Karamat here with us from DG Environment. Anna has been working on this also for quite some time, and will be therefore well positioned to explain us how the Commission is currently looking into this nexus between circular economy and biodiversity from the Commission's policy perspective. We have a long agenda. I should still mention that this event has been made possible partly by the funding from the European Commission's Erasmus funding, so the Ecovalence Research Ecovalence Jean Monnet Chair. And we will be recording this from the moment that we start the discussions in a moment, so that we will stop the recording as soon as we enter then the open discussion on the issue. We'll proceed so that we will start off with Tim, then Barbara, and then we will hear from Anna from the Commission, and then Tim will be the final one to speak. Each of the speakers have about 10 minutes to speak. I will give you a small buzz sound after, let's say, 8 minutes or so. So you have a couple of more minutes to know that time is coming close before we finalize. I think that's everything to be mentioned. There's one more forum coming 2 weeks from now, but I'll tell you more about that in the end of the session. I think with that, we are all here set to go. So I will simply welcome Tim, you to get us started, providing us first a general introduction into what is circular economy, what is the issue with biodiversity, and how these two are actually meeting together, as you've looked into this in your Sitra report. So thanks very much, Tim, for joining. I think, Tim, you are muted. Let's see your sound on. Still, I do not hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can. There we go.
I'm not sure why it's blipped out, and you can still.
You can still hear me?
We can still hear you. We can still hear you.
So, yes, I think you can also see my slide. So, yes, I would just mention, as Harry said, so I'm from the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, which works on, well, a range of different topics and related from, well, everything from democracy and fair use of data to sustainability related themes such as climate, biodiversity, and the circular economy. And in fact, Sitra was one of the first early organizations to work on the circular economy. And in 2016, Sitra led the work with the world's first national circular economy roadmap. And you also have the world's circular economy, which Sitra has led, and it's happening in a couple of weeks in Helsinki. And otherwise, it could also mention the big drive in education in Finland, circular economy learning, as well as the work that has been done to help companies to provide them with tools and for circular economy. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but we also provide insights and analysis as a sort of the think tank part of our role as a future house. And previously, we've shown that the circular economy can tackle about half of emissions in EU heavy industry in sectors such as, well, steel, plastic, cement, and aluminum. And last year, we thought if we could do something similar for biodiversity, and we have published a study, as Harry mentioned, on the potential of the circular economy in tackling biodiversity loss. So that's what I'll talk a little bit more about. And the thinking here has really been that I mentioned these materials like steel, aluminum, and cement. So there's been a lot of thinking in the circular economy for quite some time what the circular economy means for these materials, the so-called technical cycles. But when we start talking about biomass, the discourse has not really reached the same state of maturity. So we thought there was a missing piece here that we wanted to fill. And so we have dug deeper into these biomass related areas. And in this study, tackling root causes, we looked at the 4 sectors with the biggest impacts on biodiversity loss, where circular economy can also play a meaningful role. And we developed a circular economy scenario for 2050 together with Vivid Economics, which has previously provided analytics for the Discupta review on the finance of biodiversity. So just to give a sense of what we have actually modeled in the study, so we see that in the food and agriculture sector, if we would reduce meat consumption and food waste by half, and we'd drive regenerative outcomes across large areas of forests and fields, and Timo will speak more about this in a moment. And then we also looked at in the textile sector, if we use clothes longer and we make sure that the recycling rates are significantly higher than today. And if we also, in the building sector, if we make sure that buildings, well, contribute to less sprawl, also take up less building materials. We modeled 15% less building materials being used in the first place, and 12% longer lifetimes and 23% higher reuse and recycling targets. We could, together with these 4 sectors, we can free up an area of land corresponding to 1.5 times the size of the EU, and we could spare natural forests corresponding to the size of Argentina. So it has quite a significant potential if we were to unlock the full palette of solutions from a circular economy. So we see that here on this slide. If we continue as before, we'll continue to lose biodiversity well past 2050. But taken together, these four sectors can together bend the curve on biodiversity loss. So, and we see in particular food and agriculture plays a really big role. And in that sector that you see to the right here, we see the biggest solution potential coming from the shift away from land intensive and resource intensive protein sources to more diversified protein consumption, including with more plant-based alternatives, as well as less food waste. And so that's where we see the biggest impact. But we can also see so regenerative agriculture and forestry contribute about 10% to this scenario. And that shows that while it's really important that we use resources in a smarter way to make sure that we reduce our resource consumption, what we do with the area where we produce is also really important. So we'll return a bit more to that with Timo, which will shed more light on that. But to dig into the key findings here, we find that taken together, these four sectors could bend the curve on biodiversity loss and enable a small recovery back to 2000 levels by 2035. And at the same time, we see the same solutions serving as a powerful force for climate mitigation as well. And we could tackle about 90% of methane emissions in agriculture and reach the LULUCF targets in Europe by 2030. So land use change in forests, I should say. And in terms of resilience, is a bit of a buzzword. We see that in our scenario, that would enable a 30% reduction in nitrogen fertilizer use as well. So we can rely less on external inputs, which is an added benefit. And thirdly, as I mentioned, we see the largest impact coming from food and agriculture, and in particular with the shift to alternative proteins and food waste. So I would stress that those as really important areas. And those are also key indeed for pollution, climate change, and for building resilience. So that's really an area to highlight. A sort of fourth key finding is that a lot of these impacts in Europe are actually outsourced. So we know that in line with the Dasgupta review, that a lot of the biomass that we today source is from other parts of the world. So we also need to think of this as a global biodiversity as a global issue, because a lot of these findings are outsourced. Because if we there's food waste in Europe, it will have impact, for instance, on other continents. And at Sitra, so this is a conceptual piece of work that we have contributed with, but I think just to name a few examples, we have on our website a list of more than 120 circular economy examples, and we're developing a new list for next year with circular economy solutions that specifically are particularly relevant for biodiversity. And I could mention a few examples, and I think Timo has been, provided a lot of inspiration for our thinking here. And I think just to, again, underscore that it is a lot about biomass. About 80% of biodiversity loss is due to biomass use. So how we get more value from biomass is absolutely essential. So I'd highlight three things. So we can extend the lifetime and use rates of biomass through new business models. So for instance, in Finland, there's one company that has provided loading pallets for a long time. So rather than just using that once, we can use it over and over through a subscription, or as you kind of pay per use rather than just using the model once. And there's also a repair function added to that. Another example in this sort of high impact industry that forests is in terms of biodiversity, we can recycle and reuse more of the biomass. And today, for instance, timber in wood construction is not used that much. And we have shown in Baltimore in the US that you can actually reuse timber from old buildings in new buildings. So we can do a lot more than today. And thirdly, I would also just highlight that we can get more value from the biomass. We can add value to it, and we can see, for instance, forests as a system from which we can get many different things, not just wood, but also other resources. And one example of this is Natura & Co in Brazil, where you have managed to use the Eucuba seeds from a tree. So you can make health products which have higher value than if you were to just use the trees for logs. So I think these are some examples, but there are many others, but there's some from Finland, the US, and Brazil. But just to sort of wrap up, I would just, since we have the policy presence here today, just to say a few things about what this means from an EU policy perspective. So a lot of things are already being done, and I'm sure Barbara will talk more about the Circular Economy Action Plan and Biodiversity Strategy, but I would also like to emphasize these adjacent policy areas, so the bioeconomy strategy and the importance of delivering a circular bioeconomy, and also the food sector is important. So farm to fork is of course a central piece here as well. Secondly, so recognizing the limited supply of biomass, I mentioned that. So setting targets accordingly is really key. And here we see that a few member states are moving towards setting resource targets. So we see that in Finland, Austria, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and they already have targets for resource use. So we need to do more to mainstream such targets across Europe for the circular transition. However, when designing such targets, we need to prioritize key materials that are related to biomass and commodities that are responsible for the most impact on land use change. And thirdly, the EU should accelerate its efforts to diversify protein consumption, so as to turn what is today an outsourced impact into an exportable product. So in our scenario, this is not only the single largest factor that contributes to the scenario, but it's also where we can see the fastest recovery. So alternative proteins here, we think it could play an important role in the minimum criteria for sustainable public procurement in the Sustainable EU Food System Initiative, and European protein strategy could also play an important role here in driving change. So to conclude, as we don't have that much time in this transition, we need to make sure that each solution really helps to solve as many crises as possible at the same time. So a few of these areas we've highlighted hopefully provide some ground for more discussions and more research. So thank you, and I look forward to discussing more.
Thanks very much, Tim, for this outstanding introduction to the topic in itself. So really showcasing these four areas that are currently key and already pointing us towards the policy discussions as well, which is the smooth transition then to Barbara, to you. So IUCN is working on the policies, and international and European level, you're focusing on the EU. So over to you.
Thank you. Let me try now to find the correct slide. Let me know if everyone can see this and if you can hear me fine. Okay, cool. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm Barbara. I'm working as the Senior Policy and Project Officer at IUCN's European Regional Office in Brussels. And I'll tell you a little bit more today about our recent work on the circular economy. But just to briefly introduce IUCN for those who might be less familiar, we are the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, founded in 1948. We're a membership union, which is uniquely composed of both governments and civil society organizations. You might know IUCN for our red list of threatened species. That's one of our more known knowledge products. But in addition to having knowledge products as well, we work on convening stakeholders and facilitating dialogue and action for nature conservation, all towards the goal of addressing biodiversity loss. So we know that biodiversity loss and climate change are really two sides of the same coin, and the biodiversity challenge alone is enormous. If we look at data collected by IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species, IPBES estimates that about 1 million species are currently threatened with extinction. And the International Resource Panel estimated recently that more than 90% of biodiversity loss is due to the extraction and processing of natural resources. So then we can say that aside from conservation and restoration activities, in this context, the circular economy can be a great tool to tackle these key drivers of biodiversity loss. And during the past couple of years, there has been and there continues to be an important effort to see how the circular economy can best contribute to these environmental goals. We've been working together with partners, including Sitra, and I'll get to our collaboration later at the end of the presentation, but this has involved to start with a series of reports that look deeper into the issue. So also, we produced a report last December. We launched this at the COP15 in Montreal. This is our report towards a circular economy that begins and ends in nature. And the angles that we took were, of course, we are an environmental organization entering the circular economy discussion, so biodiversity was our starting point. And then, of course, coming from the IUCN Brussels office, working on policy, we took on a policy focus as well. So through examining potential challenges and opportunities in existing relevant policy, we aimed to identify some ways where we could more closely interlink, on the one hand, the transition to circular economy, and on the other hand, the protection. So with the protection and restoration of nature. We don't aim to provide a comprehensive and in-depth exploration of all the possible links between the two policy areas, because if you don't already know, you will see that there are many. And we don't propose one definitive way forward, but we have tried to shed some light on this not yet fully explored space in between, illustrating some of the ways in which the two areas could help mutually reinforce one another. So, we started by outlining the general policy context at the global and EU level. In analyzing the work of the CBD, and this was before the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted, there was at the time no direct mention of the circular economy in those texts, and there still isn't now post-adoption. However, references to the circular economy were already then not absent, but rather implicit. So the draft text and now the adopted text, they contain important targets on pollution, that's target 7, on production, target 10, on consumption as well, target 16, and others. But much of our policy analysis in the report focused on the EU level, and we looked into the European Green Deal. And the European Green Deal was an incredibly important step towards the further integration of many environmental policy agendas, but of course these two as well, circular economy and biodiversity. Two key strategies came out under this umbrella, and each of them vital to how the respective sector will be shaped in the coming years. I'm talking, of course, about the Circular Economy Action Plan and the EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2030. And these are the two policy files that our report examined in greater detail. We did a deep dive on the key value chain in the Circular Economy Action Plan that is the most impactful for biodiversity, and that is the food, water, and nutrients key value chain. We took a closer look at 4 key areas. Part of this value chain, you can see them on the slide. And so for each of them, we looked into what the Circular Economy Action Plan aimed to do and tried to see how this would contribute to the goals outlined in the Biodiversity Strategy to 2030. I was going to say a little bit about all of them, but maybe I'll focus on the first 2, given also we are short on time. But on the sustainable use of renewable bio-based materials, this is a section very much focused on the bioeconomy. And the bioeconomy perhaps poses the greatest impact to biodiversity through land and resource use. Here, for example, a shift from fossil-based to bio-based materials is an important objective, but we don't want such a push to lead to unintended trade-offs. For instance, and Tim mentioned timber before, if an increased demand for timber as a sustainable building material would inadvertently lead to a loss of primary forest, for example, that would not be aligned with achieving both objectives. At the same time, this means that a circular bioeconomy has incredible potential in tackling biodiversity loss. And Tim already outlined some important statistics, for instance, that a circular food and agriculture sector would make a huge contribution to biodiversity recovery. Sorry, I'm trying to rush a bit. The second target on the reduction of food waste, Of course, targeting food waste is incredibly vital because as the FAO estimates, we currently waste about 1/3 of the food that we produce. But while reducing food waste and loss is important, it's not the only thing and not enough to address biodiversity loss. When we can really be thinking of the whole system, next to how much food we are producing and wasting, it's important to examine also how we are producing it. And there are a number of sustainable agricultural practices which align well with the principles of the circular economy, like reducing pollution and waste through a reduction in pesticide and fertilizer application, enabling nitrogen and other nutrient cycling, also improving water efficiency and soil quality, and so on. And of course, I think also Tim mentioned that, I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much, but it's important to examine what kind of food we are producing. I think we're well aware by now that the meat and dairy production is incredibly land and resource intensive. So then I'll skip to the next slide on this word cloud, because through this exercise, this deep dive that we did, we actually were able to touch on a whole host of policies that are or that would still be important to more closely consider when seeking further policy integration between the circular economy and biodiversity, so that circular economy policy measures can better fulfill the biodiversity targets. We found it would be specifically beneficial to ensure closer alignment with policies that are dealing with production and consumption, like the Common Agricultural Policy, the Farm to Fork Strategy, with the extraction and processing of biological resources in general, so all policies to do with biomass, the bioeconomy, forestry, agricultural land use, and also even more explicit links to key nature policies like the Birds and Habitats Directives. We didn't do a deep dive in each of these policies on the slide, but it's just to show how many different policy areas actually emerge as relevant in this intersection. So bringing us to some, now you see some sectors here again on the slide that are very impactful. So a few things emerge as crucial as well from our deep dive. That circular economy policy thus far has not focused that much on the biological resources in the economy. It's been more focused on the technical components, products, materials that undergo reuse, repair, remanufacture, recycling, but it is really the biological resources, biomass, the bioeconomy that are incredibly impactful and need our attention. And certain sectors, food and agriculture, forestry, they hold significant potential benefits for nature and biodiversity if they were to become fully circular. Land use needs to be of central concern for circular economy policy, especially through supporting sustainable land use in agricultural and forestry practices. More attention will need to be paid to extraction and production, encompassing the whole life cycle and not only the end of life stage waste, and ultimately keeping in line with the circular economy in terms of the waste hierarchy. We can also speak of much being able to be achieved through tackling consumption, with prevention the first priority. 3 takeaways. To support the transition to a circular economy with nature at its core, it will be fundamental to enhance policy coherence. That will remain fundamental. And a systemic approach here is needed, not only in terms of policies, but practice, considering the whole system, technical and biological cycles, waste and production and consumption. Conservation and restoration will remain crucial activities in the fight against these crises that we have, especially if we want to ensure the sustainability of our production systems in the first place and the continued use of our natural resources. And of course, the transition to a circular economy that both begins and ends in nature, that can transform our unsustainable production and consumption systems, is an invaluable tool in helping us achieve our fast approaching environmental goals. And it's this nexus that we need to pay close attention to. It's not only about biodiversity, but also climate. Looking at that together will be important to avoid any potential, even unintended trade-offs, as described earlier, linked to a shift from fossil-based to bio-based materials, for instance. As a classic climate solution, we don't want that to be presenting any unintended issues for nature biodiversity. And I promise I'm ending on this note, just as a bit of context for our work, but also the way forward. we started and we continue this journey through the European Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform. This is a platform hosted by the European Commission, who is coming next, which is great, and the European Economic and Social Committee as well. It's a joint venture. IUCN has been a coordination group member of the platform since 2020, and you can probably spy some other partners you might recognize on the slide. Last year, we launched the leadership group on biodiversity and climate. So we're connecting these two objectives there, and IUCN is chairing this leadership group. We've produced, members of this leadership group actually have produced a number of reports. That's Sitra, you've seen, us, you've seen, INEC, the French National Committee on the Circular Economy, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and coming soon is a report by the European Environment Agency. We also brought the discussion on this nexus to the World Conservation Congress in Marseille, to the Climate COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, to the Biodiversity COP15 in Montreal, and then this last spring, we dedicated half a day of the annual Circular Economy Stakeholder Conference in Brussels to biodiversity. And we recently, building on all of this, outlined and published our priorities for 2023. We wish to look further into concrete examples, case studies, and best practices that embrace this nexus. We wish to focus on key sectors. Today, we're also touching a bit on the bioeconomy in that respect. We wish to further engage the biodiversity and climate communities as well to bring them into the circular economy discussion. We wish to engage further with the international dimension now that we have the global biodiversity framework agreed and implementation becomes crucial. And of course, promote policy coherence. I will end on this to kind of hand over to the Commission, but here it's about aligning with crucial, including upcoming environmental policies such as the Nature Restoration Law, as well as sectoral policies linking to the bioeconomy, the Renewable Energy Directive, the Sustainable Food Systems Framework Initiative, and the current and already future, which is being discussed, Common Agricultural Policy, among others. And thank you for your attention. So I will end here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So moving from Tim's 4 sectors and a lot of course, overlap in pointing to the consumption importance of that and the key sectors that you mentioned. And like you said, policy coherence, a lot of initiatives that you notice and you're highlighting in the Commission that are taking place, which are, in your view, of great relevance, which highlights the importance that these things have to work together as well. But let's see from the Commission how that's going to move forward, indeed. So Anna, welcome and thanks so much for joining us here today. So great to hear from you.
Hello. I don't know how I'm going to share my
slides. Okay, I can also share them from here if that views.
Yes, please, could you do it? I'm sorry.
Yep, no problem.
I've been trying to do it, but it didn't work. What can you explain? I do share content.
It's okay, give me just 1 second. I'll be just with you. Put this in the presentation mode still.
Sorry about that.
And now I'm going to share it. And then you just have to tell me when to change the slide. Give me just 1 more second and I will open the. So do you now see the slides?
Yes.
Yes,
very good.
We see them.
Yes.
So, yes, thank you very much. My name is Anna Karamat. I work in DG Environment of the European Commission in the Biodiversity Unit, and I deal with the economic aspect of biodiversity, including the links with circular economy. Next slide, please. I would like to just show you, you probably all know very well this figure. It shows the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a figure that shows very well how biodiversity and nature are the foundation of our existence, of our quality of life, and also of our economy. We can see the latest data that keeps coming up is that the state of nature, the state of species, the state of habitats continue to deteriorate. So there is a real need, if we want to preserve this basis for our existence, to stop this loss of biodiversity. In order to do that, it's very important to look at biodiversity in connection with climate change and in connection with the other crises that we face, like pollution, but also taking into account circular economy. And to do that, we have to completely rethink and have a systematic change of the way that we produce and consume. Next slide, please. The Commission tried to do exactly that with its Green Deal, which is the EU's new growth strategy, which aims to move towards a sustainable economy, which takes into account our climate objectives, so achieving climate neutrality, which also takes into account reaching of our other environmental objectives, which we call protecting our natural capital. So that's biodiversity, that's food, that's pollution, that's circular economy, that's plastics, and the blue economy. And all of that should be done in a socially just way. So we need to find a way to finance this transition without leaving anybody behind. Next slide, please. One of the main elements of the Green Deal is the EU Biodiversity Strategy that we adopted in 2020. And the main objective of which, the overall objective, is to put Europe's biodiversity back on a path to recovery by 2030. It's the most ambitious strategy we've ever had. It looks at strengthening the protection of nature by expanding the areas that we want to protect, but also by improving the level of protection, because we see that even in the Natura 2000 areas that we have, the status of species and habitats, many of them are not in good condition. So we don't only want to expand the area, but also increase the level of protection in those areas. The next thing is that just increasing the level of protected areas is not sufficient. We have to go one step further and also take action to restore degraded areas. And for that, the strategy has announced a nature restoration action plans. One action of which is the nature restoration law, to which I will come later on. But it also addresses the main drivers of biodiversity loss, like agriculture, like forestry, like pollution, and protecting our oceans. Compared to previous strategies, what we have also worked on is to improve the enabling framework to reach our objectives. So we need to improve the enforcement of our current legislation. That's very important, we need to improve the monitoring framework and the collection of data to improve our knowledge of biodiversity and what we need to do to improve. We need to, of course, work on education and research. And we want to have all sectors of society on board as stakeholders, including, very importantly, the business sector, on which I am doing a lot of work. And then the strategy recognizes that the EU cannot act to achieve the objectives on its own. So we really need to work together with third countries to achieve an ambitious global agenda. And I will also say a few words about COP15 and the Global Biodiversity Framework that we adopted later on. So Barbara showed us this cloud image, which showed a very, very high number of policy initiatives which are important and which are relevant for biodiversity and circular economy. I cannot go in all of them. So I will focus on the nature restoration regulation, on the forest policy, on the deforestation regulation, food policy, and the global biodiversity framework. Next, please. So under the nature restoration plan of the biodiversity strategy, the Commission announced that it would come up with a proposal for legally binding restoration targets for member states. And this proposal was presented in June 2022. It's now being discussed in Council and Parliament. The overarching objective is to achieve restoration measures that cover 20% of the EU's land and sea area by 2030, and that by 2050, we have restoration measures in place for all degraded ecosystems in the EU. So the draft regulation proposes quantified restoration targets for habitats which are covered by the Habitats Directive and other habitats like urban areas, farmland birds, peatlands under agricultural use, for which we have enough information to set specific targets. For other ecosystems, we have the obligation to develop indicators and to show an improvement of the trend in the coming years. Member states will be the ones to choose which areas to restore, and they will have to do that by developing nature restoration plans in which they set the best baselines and the measures, in which they also define how to find the financing. That will be a big issue. And they will have to involve all the stakeholders. So farmers, civil society, businesses, municipalities, local governments, everybody should be involved in developing these plans. Next slide, please. The biodiversity strategy also mentions, and this has been mentioned already by Tim and by Barbara before, that the food sector, food and agri, is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. And it's also one of the areas where biodiversity and circular economy are very closely linked. So in the farm to fork strategy, the Commission has defined what should be the objectives to transform our food system into a more sustainable and healthy one. This will include reducing the use and the risk of pesticides, reducing the loss of nutrients and the use of fertilizers, reducing the use of antimicrobials for farmed animals, boosting the area of organic farming in the EU, empowering consumers to choose healthy and sustainable diets, and halving the per capita amount of food waste, percentage of food waste. The Commission is now working on a legislative initiative on a sustainable food initiative, which aims to implement these objectives. It's not clear yet in which direction it will go. We're still in the planning stage, but it looks like, so we are looking into labeling of sustainability labeling of food, using public procurement to procure more sustainable food. And also we will try to define principles and requirements for EU sustainable food systems, and try to integrate these into the different legislation that applies to food. So it's a very, very ambitious plan, and it's planned to be adopted by the Commission as a proposal this year. Next slide. So the other area, topic, which is of crucial importance, not only for biodiversity, but also for climate change, and where circular economy plays a very important role, is forests. We have adopted an EU forest strategy, and there you can see the different elements. One part of the strategy focuses on having a more sustainable forest-based bioeconomy. And there we think it's necessary to firstly promote long-lived wood products. I think Tim has also mentioned this. If wood is used for bioenergy, then we need to strengthen the sustainability criteria. And we also need to promote non-wood bioeconomy, so promote other products that forests can deliver and with which foresters can make profits. The second part is about strengthening the protection and restoring EU forests to combat climate change, reverse biodiversity loss, and ensure resilient forest ecosystems. We are preparing, I think we have issued guidelines on strict protection of primary and old growth forests and on biodiversity-friendly afforestation and reforestation. We will also come up with guidelines for close-to-nature forestry, because we think that this has a lot of potential in the future. Close-to-nature forestry is really the best way to protect forests. And it also, we have seen that it can also give profits for forest owners. And of course,
Anna,
yes.
go ahead.
Am I already over the time? Sorry.
Yes, I was just going to suggest that if you finish this, I could show the slide on deforestation, which you could perhaps quickly allude to, but then we could perhaps wrap up there.
Sorry, okay.
No worries.
So the next, as also, please, next slide. As has been mentioned already before, the loss of biodiversity in third countries is largely driven by EU consumption. The EU deforestation regulation aims to eliminate deforestation which is caused by consumption in the EU. It will look in particular at soy, beef, palm oil, wood, cocoa, coffee, rubber, and some of the derived products. And as of the end of 2024, so the regulation is in the last stages of adoption. There is a political agreement already, but there needs to be a formal adoption. And if that happens now, then the regulation will enter into force end of 2024. And from that time on, only deforestation-free products and legal products, meaning products that comply with national legislation, may be placed on the EU market. And there will be mandatory due diligence rules for any company that wants to place commodities or products on the EU market or to export such products from the EU market. And then the last slide that I have is about the global discussions.
Right, but perhaps I would say that as we focus on the EU policies, perhaps we skip that and we leave the floor next to Timo, who will be able to continue on the forestation issues, getting more concrete, giving us more concrete examples of what can happen and is actually happening. So very recent developments from the company front. So Timo, I will stop sharing my screen and then you are good to go from your end.
Thank you. Can you hear my voice?
Yes, very well.
Great, great. And my slide yes. As well. Great. So hi all, my name is Timo and I work as biologist in Metsä Group, and my topic today is to demonstrate our regenerative forestry strategy we launched in March this spring several weeks ago. The focus is on northern boreal forests. And shortly about company, Metsä Group is international forest player in forest sector, near 10,000 people working at Metsä Group, very traditional forest company in the north. Roots are in Finland, but businesses in very many countries, and quite diverse wood-based product portfolio in place nowadays. Sales were last year roughly 7 billion euros. Then we go to this systemic change and views, where we are looking for roadmap for net positive impact on biodiversity as a part of forest management in our operations, and this history, this red area is our joint tradition in the whole economy and bioeconomy as well, where we have made a lot of money for decades, but losing nature at the same time, and what is now ahead, and the only view is to achieve no net loss and net positive impact in the future, to create new way of doing, regenerate the land, and to find that kind of commercial scale, industrial scale production solutions where are not having negative impact on biodiversity in the long run, and not negative impact on critical ecosystem services as a part of wood production. I saw this from Finland, where we are meeting. I was just in Germany last week, where we saw very huge damages in forests, and the situation in Central Europe, especially with the spruce dominated forests. 1.5 Celsius globally would mean more than 5 Celsius in Finland and in Scandinavia, and that means that in the north, where forest rotation is very long, from 60 years to more than 100 years, the trees we plant this year will meet Central European climate in their life cycle during next tree rotation. And then we come to the question, how to adapt this very significant critical change, how to find that kind of tree species solutions and silvicultural methods where we safeguard our forest health. And this national strategy, climate strategy, is very much to adapt to national climate change. If we don't adapt to climate change nationally, we never can maintain or enhance carbon sinks in forests. And then we come to the some kind of combination and view of win-win-win solutions, where our target is to not just to maintain, but to enhance biodiversity and forest ecosystem diversity as a part of wood procurement and forest management. To adapt to climate change, to get more diverse tree species composition, more deadwood volumes, and to recognize those critical elements which are typical and important in natural forest. We can mimic natural forest and then take more these elements to the land which is in commercial use. This is very important to all forest players and organizations inside forest sector, how to motivate forest owners and other parties which are participating this and which is part of their everyday life and incomes. And I have just had roadshow here in Finland, where I met more than 1,000 private forest owners, and it was very important to demonstrate this biodiversity issue by demonstrating silvicultural and wood production based and business-oriented motivation to safeguard forest nature, in addition to recognize this nature's absolute value as well. But internal motivation is very important. This is our external objectives we have launched in the end of March, that our goal is to strengthen the nature. The questions about the public target to halt biodiversity loss by 2030 as a part of our regenerative forestry strategy, without any kind of external ecological compensation mechanisms or some other initiatives which are quite unclear for us how they work in practice finally when thinking nature impacts. So the target is out, and then we are in the process where we analyze with researchers, where we analyze the starting points, and this northern way to produce wood is the questions about native tree species as commercial tree species. We use commercially only spruce, pine, and birch, and a little bit aspen, which are tree species which have spread to Finland after last ice age. They are in their natural distribution area, and those are growing and produced in their natural habitats they have adapted in their evolution. That's the starting point to integrate this commercial scale production without to the land, so that there is no land use change or conversion at all. And that's the difference to any other or those examples from agriculture or exotic tree species plantations, where the starting point is to destroy or convert original ecosystem away to establish commercial scale production. Most of the species are still living in our commercial forest despite of commercial scale wood production, but we have lost many species, and now the new target is to increase the number of those native tree species, so the proportion of native species in commercial land, to rise that proportion. And the target is to create biodiversity index for this level of the number of proportion of species in the native to the area in production site. Is it 75 or 80 at this moment? But that's roughly the level. And in converted lands, in agricultural fields or exotic tree plantations, from those examples, the level is much more lower, because there is no that original ecosystem that not exist anymore.
That's the 8-minute mark.
Yeah. This is our view is that biodiversity is the basis for not just bioeconomy but economy in total, and our strategy for biodiversity includes targets, actions, monitoring program, impacts, and verification. When we have all these in place, we are in the right track. And now we have set the targets, we have annual action plans, and targets to demonstrate the impacts as well. And then this biodiversity nature value for business players. In addition to this nature's absolute value, it's important to have public discussion of resilience of individual society, economy, and ecosystems. Security of supply chain reserves are very, very good motivation to safeguard the nature. And then these ecosystem services to have more strategical, holistic view on all ecosystem services, not just wood, not just carbon sink as in land use sector, but to recognize that there are very many critical national ecosystem services and benefits, and as we have seen from the news, water resources are very critical in many countries in Europe today, as we have seen. But it's the situation in every country that it's important to recognize those nationally critical ecosystem services compared to, for example, carbon sink, which is critical global climate change mitigation, but nothing to do with nationally critical ecosystem services for people living in there in a when thinking direct impact. And wood-based products to produce products which you have all used every day in your everyday life. Products what you need, no, not those products what you probably want to use, but what we really need. Not going to the details, but these are we have quite detailed action plans and indicators, and to get more diverse tree species composition, more dead wood, more diverse forest structure are key elements to get species back and to increase the number of native forest species. And then we have recognized these biodiversity hotspots at the regional or national level to manage those in a specific way, to take them into account that forest is always mosaic and not the same kind of habitat everywhere. This is very typical northern forest estate regenerated so that the previous rotation was more monoculture without very much dead wood, and next rotation is more diverse when thinking tree species or deadwood volumes or deadwood diversity, and this structural diversity as well. Through these methods, our target is that there are hundreds number of species is much more higher. The question is about hundreds of species more compared to previous one, which was more monoculture. And the time is this period. Rotation period is of course very long. And this is not the new thing. We have been developing these biodiversity actions from 1990s, and these examples where we have the situation where we have the first species results when we are talking about new habitats for red-listed species, and these are example of retention trees which have fell down on a harvesting site, which are still in National Red Book, but we are expecting that we will get them away from the next assessment, and these are not demonstrating that we are achieved what we want, but these are very important to encourage forest owners and forest companies to continue and to commit to continuous improvement. Thank you.